There is a small printed volume in the Hokkaido University Library, in a special collection room in Sapporo, Japan. It is approximately 20 centimeters tall, bound in cloth, and it contains 13 pieces of oral poetry that were never meant to be written down. The book is called the Ainu Shinyoshu. It was transcribed in 1922 by a young Ainu woman named Yukiya Chiri, who was 19 years old at the time, and who died of heart failure on the night she finished the manuscript. She was working with the Tokyo Imperial University linguist, Kyosuke Kindaichi, spent years convincing Ainu elders to dictate their sacred songs into Japanese phonetic script. Before the last fluent speakers died, the songs are called yukar. They describe a class of sky beings called kamui, who descended to the islands of what is now northern Japan, taught the first people, and then withdrew. It is called the Ainu Shinyoshu, and what happened? When Kindaichi began to compare these songs to the official Shinto chronicles, is one of the strangest and most under-discussed problems in early Japanese studies. The Ainu Shinyoshu as a printed book is barely a century old. First edition came out of a small publisher in Tokyo in 1923. But the contents are not from that period. The yukar are oral compositions, transmitted by memorization across generations of Ainu elders, and the linguistic stratum they preserve is far older than the Shinto written canon. The Kojiki, foundational chronicle of Japanese imperial mythology, was compiled in 712 CE. The Nihon Shoki followed in 720 CE. Kindaichi's reading of the yukar suggests that the sky descent narratives the Ainu were singing predate both of these texts by a margin that mainstream Japanese folklore studies has been reluctant to quantify. If you find that the academic literature on Japan's pre-Shinto past has been incomplete, if you suspect there are recordings and field notebooks still sitting in university archives, waiting for someone to read them differently, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that's the question you've been looking for. The rest of us continue. The orthodox reading of the Ainu yukar within Japanese folklore studies is that they are religious oral literature comparable to other indigenous epic traditions. Kindaichi himself, working within the conventions of early 20th century linguistics, described them as kamui yukar, songs of the gods, and treated them primarily as material for comparative mythology. The mainstream view, codified by scholars at Hokkaido University and at the National Museum of Ethnology in Osaka, is that the Ainu sky deities are products of an animistic worldview shared in broad outline with other northern Pacific peoples. The Niv of Sakhalin, the Aitelman of Kamchatka, the indigenous peoples of the lower Amur. Under this reading, resemblance between Kamui descent narratives and the Shinto descent of Ninigi from the high plane of heaven is convergent religious imagination, not historical memory of a shared earlier event. The break in the conventional reading begins with Kindaichi's own field notes, which are preserved in the Northern Studies collection at Hokkaido University in Sapporo. Kindaichi is not a fringe figure. He held the chair of Ainu linguistics at Tokyo Imperial University for decades, and he is regarded in Japan as the founder of Ainu philology. What he documented, and what alternative readers of his archive have argued in the decades since, is that certain yukar contain astronomical references that can be anchored to specific celestial events. The kamui in these passages do not descend from a vague heaven. They descend along named star paths. They arrive in named seasons. They depart. When specific constellations rotate out of the northern sky, the configurations described correspond to skies visible from Hokkaido in approximately the 3rd millennium BCE, well before the earliest written Japanese chronicle, and consistent with the period of the late Jomon culture, the archaeological culture that preceded the Yayoi migrations from the Asian mainland. The methodology is straightforward. You take the song, you isolate the astronomical descriptions, you run them backward against modern planetarium software. You see when the sky last looked the way the song says it looked. This is the same procedure that Alan Bond and Mark Hempsell used on the planisphere of Nineveh, held in room 55 of the British Museum. It is not speculative, it is arithmetic. What it means, if this astronomical anchor is substantially correct, is that the Ainu were preserving, in oral form, memory of sky observations made roughly 2,000 years before the imperial Japanese state existed as a literate entity. Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki were composed under the political sponsorship of the Yamata court, tell the story of a divine lineage that descends from the sun goddess Amaterasu through her grandson Ninigi to the first emperor Jinmu, conventionally dated to 660 BCE. That date is itself a calculation, a back projection from later imperial reign lengths, and most modern historians treat it as legendary rather than historical. The Yukar, by contrast, do not concern themselves with imperial legitimacy. They describe sky beings teaching agriculture, fire management, the carving of canoes, the language of bears. They name specific mountains in Hokkaido as landing sites. They name specific rivers as the routes the Kamui followed inland. One of the most studied Yukar, the Song of the Owl God, transcribed by Yuki Chiri, opens with a sky descent and ends with the deity returning to the upper world after teaching a single family. The geographic anchoring is exact. The mountain is Mount Poroshiri in the Hidaka range of central Hokkaido. The river is the Saru. These are not mythological coordinates. They are coordinates that anyone can find on a map. If you want to check this, Ainu Shinyoshu has been republished multiple times by Iwanami Shoten in Tokyo, and an English translation by Sarah Strong was published by the University of Hawaii Press in the early 21st century. The book is available. Astronomical software is free. The fieldwork notebooks are in Sapporo. What follows from this, if the dating holds, is that the indigenous people of the Japanese archipelago retained a continuous oral record of contact with sky-descended beings for at least 3,000 years, and that this record was actively suppressed or simply ignored when the Yamato court constructed its own divine descent narrative in 8th century CE. The Ainu were not assimilated, they were displaced. Their language was banned in schools in the late 19th century. The Yukar nearly died with the elders Kindaichi was racing against. What we have, we almost did not have. The academic response to the astronomical reading of the Yukar has been, almost without exception, silence, not refutation, silence. Published paper in mainstream Japanese folklore studies has taken Kindaichi's later astronomical notes and produced a counter-calculation showing that the star references in the Yukar are consistent with a later period, or with no period at all, or with a generic, poetic sky rather than a specific observed sky. The omission is selective. Kindaichi's linguistic work on the Ainu language is cited in every serious treatment of Japanese historical linguistics. His astronomical observations on the Yukar are not cited. They are simply left out of the bibliography. Mauro Biglino, former Vatican translator of Biblical Hebrew, has described a similar pattern in the treatment of his own work. Engagement with the parts of a researcher's output that fit the consensus, and quiet omission of the parts that do not. The pattern in Japanese Ainu studies is identical. Form of the dismissal matters. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. It requires saying which yucca, which star reference, calculation is wrong, and showing why. Dismissal requires only a characterization, that the astronomical reading is amateur, that it overreads the poetic material, that the Ainu elders were not astronomers. None of these characterizations have been published in peer review. They circulate in conference corridors and in the introductions to anthologies. The work itself remains where Kindaichi left it, in notebooks in Sapporo, and the question of whether the Ainu were preserving a 3,000-year-old sky observation is, in the mainstream Japanese academic literature, treated as if it had never been asked. The audience for whom this matters has had to find it on its own. To understand why the yucca matter, it helps to understand who the Ainu were before the Japanese state arrived on their islands. The Ainu were not Japanese. They are genetically and linguistically distinct from the Yamato Japanese, and recent genome studies have shown that the Ainu carry a substantial inheritance from the Jomon population, the people who occupied the Japanese archipelago for approximately 14,000 years, before the Yayoi rice farmers arrived from the Korean peninsula around 300 BCE. Komon are one of the longest continuous archaeological cultures in human history. Their pottery is among the oldest in the world. Their settlements at sites like Sanai Maruyama in Aomori Prefecture show populations of several hundred people living in planned villages with timber halls and astronomical alignments more than 5,000 years ago. The Ainu, in the broadest sense, are what is left of that world. Their language is a true isolate. It has no demonstrated relationship to Japanese, to Korean, to any of the Tungusic languages of Siberia, or to any other living family. The Yukar are recited in this language, and they preserve vocabulary that has no cognates anywhere. When Kindaichi was working in the early 20th century, he was recording a linguistic inheritance that had already been narrowing for centuries under Japanese pressure. By the time Yukichiri sat down to transcribe the songs, only a handful of elders could perform a complete yukar from memory. The performance itself was a discipline. Full Kamui yukar could take an entire night to sing, and the singer was expected to maintain a specific rhythm marked by tapping a wooden striker against the edge of a hearth. The world the singers described was not a generic mythological landscape. It was Hokkaido. The mountains had names. The rivers had names. The bears had names. The Kamui who descended did so into a place the singers themselves had walked. Among the most striking elements of the cosmology is the structure of the sky. The Ainu sky is layered. There is the lower sky, where ordinary weather happens. There is the middle sky, where the named Kamui live in villages of their own. And there is the upper sky, Kanto Core Kamui, the realm of the highest deity, where the spirits of the dead eventually pass. This structure is not generic. It has specific parallels in Sumerian cosmology, which divides the heavens into the realms of An, Enlil, and Enki, and in the pyramid texts of Unas at Saqqara, where the pharaoh's spirit ascends through layered skies to join the imperishable stars. Parallels are not proof of contact. They are proof that across distant cultures, certain observers settled on the same architectural description of the sky. The Yukar belong in this comparative literature. They have rarely been placed there. Most studies of comparative cosmology in the English language do not mention the Ainu at all. Few that do treat the Yukar as charming local colour rather than as data. This is not because the data is poor, because the data is in a notebook in Sapporo, and the researcher who collected it died in 1971. The clearest cross-cultural parallel to the Ainu Yukar within Japan itself is found in a set of documents whose authenticity is far more contested. These are the Takanouchi manuscripts associated with the Kosokotai Jingu shrine in Toyama Prefecture, brought to public attention in the early 20th century by Kiyomaro Takanouchi, claimed they had been preserved in his family for 68 generations. The Takanouchi texts describe a pre-Shinto period in which sky kings, called Sumera Mikoto, ruled the Japanese islands and travelled between continents in vessels described in terms that modern readers have variously interpreted as flying craft. Mainstream Japanese scholarship considers the Takenouchi manuscripts to be modern forgeries, and there is good documentary reason to be cautious about them. What is interesting is not the manuscripts themselves, but the resonance. Takenouchi material, whatever its origin, describes sky beings descending to specific Japanese locations, teaching specific arts, and withdrawing. The Ainu yuka, recorded independently from oral sources in a separate language, describe sky beings descending to specific Japanese locations, teaching specific arts and withdrawing. The conventional explanation that the resemblance reflects a general East Asian mythological pattern, diffused from a common source, does not fully account for the geographic specificity of both bodies of material. Both name actual mountains, name actual rivers. Both describe arrivals from above rather than from the sea, which is unusual for an island nation mythology, where most foreign contact came by boat. The Anunnaki narrative recorded in the Sumerian king list, held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, follows the same architectural pattern. Sky beings descend. They reign, they teach, they withdraw or are removed. 3 independent traditions on 3 different landmasses describe the same shape of event. The strongest objection to the astronomical reading of the yuka comes from within Ainu, studies itself. It runs as follows. Oral poetry is not a transcript. It is a living performance, and the celestial imagery in the yuka may have shifted across generations as singers updated their references to the sky they themselves observed. The argument is serious. Oral traditions in many cultures do drift, and astronomical references are particularly prone to update because the sky is in front of every performer. If this is correct, the star configuration identified in Kindaichi's archive might reflect the sky of the 17th or 18th century, not the 3rd millennium BCE. The element this objection does not fully account for is the geographic precision. Drifting oral tradition tends to lose place names, not preserve them. The yuka preserve mountain names, river names, seasonal markers, with a consistency that suggests fixation rather than drift. The debate over whether the astronomical anchor holds remains genuinely unresolved. If the astronomical anchor holds, the implication is that the indigenous oral record of the Japanese islands is approximately twice as old as the official imperial chronicle, and that the sky beings of pre-Shinto Japan were being remembered in continuous performance for at least 3,000 years before they were finally written down by a dying young woman in 1922. The Ainu Shinyoshu is real. The notebooks are in Sapporo. The question is still open. The Ainu Shinyoshu is in the Hokkaido University Library in Sapporo. Copies are in print. Iwanami Shoten reissues it. The English translation is available. Kyosu Kindaichi's field notebooks are preserved in the Northern Studies collection at the same university, alongside his unpublished astronomical correspondences with the yuka texts. Yuki Chiri's transcription is exactly what it appears to be. 19-year-old Ainu woman wrote it down in 1922 and died the same night she finished. What the Ainu elders watched cross the northern sky in the 3rd millennium BCE, and what they said descended on the slopes of Mount Purashiri and travelled inland along the Saru River is still open. Published paper in mainstream Japanese folklore. Studies has produced a counter-calculation. No published paper has shown that the star references in the yuka belong to a later period. The work that Kindaichi did has not been refuted. It has been left where he left it. It has been open since Yuki Chiri set down the last line of her manuscript in 1922. It is still open now,